A security guard's thick palm pressed flat against James Michael Jr.'s chest, stopping him mid-step in the gleaming marble lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel. The guard's jaw was tight, his eyes cold and dismissive as he looked James up and down from his worn gray hoodie to his faded sneakers and spoke words that would change everything in the next 10 minutes. I don't know where you think you're going, but this isn't the place for you. Turn around, walk out, and don't come back. James looked at the hand on his chest. Then he looked at the name tag on the guard's uniform. Then slowly, a smile crept across his face. Because what this guard didn't know, what none of these people knew, was that James Michael Jr. was about to do something he had hoped he would never have to do. He was about to become exactly like his father, and when James Michael Saar got angry, empires trembled. To understand what happened in that lobby, you have to understand where James had come from, not just that day, but his entire life. James Michael Jr. was 31 years old, and he had spent the last 8 months living in a small village in rural Guatemala helping build water purification systems for communities that had never had clean drinking water. He had slept on dirt floors. He had eaten meals cooked over open fires. He had held the hands of children who looked at him with pure gratitude in their eyes. Children who didn't care about his last name or his family's net worth. They only cared that he showed up day after day and worked beside them. That was the kind of man James was. He didn't want attention. He didn't want recognition. He certainly didn't want to be treated differently because of who his father was. In fact, for most of his adult life, James had actively hidden his connection to the Michael Hotel Group, one of the largest black-owned hotel chains in the entire country, with properties spanning from Los Angeles to New York, from Miami to Chicago. His father, James Michael Saar, had built that empire from absolutely nothing, from poverty, from pain, from a childhood where he was told every single day that a black man would never amount to anything in the hospitality industry. James Saar had proven them all wrong. But he had done it with a fire in his belly and an iron will that sometimes made him hard to love. And James Gr. Well, he had inherited his mother's gentleness, her patience, her belief that people deserved second chances. The Grand Meridian was the crown jewel of the Michael Empire. It sat in the heart of downtown, a 42-story monument to elegance, its glass facade reflecting the city skyline like a mirror kissing the clouds. The lobby alone was worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Italian marble floors polished to a mirror shine. Chandeliers dripping with crystal that caught the afternoon light and scattered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Fresh flowers imported from Holland arranged in massive vases that sat atop pedestals carved from black onyx. The guests who walked through those revolving doors were royalty, celebrities, politicians, business moguls. They wore watches that cost more than cars and carried handbags that were waiting lists long. The staff had been trained to recognize wealth, to smell it, to anticipate it, and in their minds they had built a very specific picture of what wealth looked like. That picture did not include a tired-looking black man in a hoodie, carrying a worn duffel bag with dust still clinging to the cuffs of his jeans. James pushed through the revolving door and stepped into the lobby, and for a moment he just stood there, breathing in the familiar scent of jasmine and sandalwood that had been his father's signature choice for every Michael property. He hadn't been to this hotel in over a year. Hadn't seen his father in almost as long. Their relationship was complicated. Love tangled up with expectation, admiration wrapped in frustration. A son who wanted to be his own man, and a father who couldn't understand why his son didn't want everything he had built. But James was here now because his mother had called him. She had called him and told him his father's health was declining, that the doctors had found something. That time might be shorter than anyone wanted to admit. So James had boarded the first flight out of Guatemala City, had traveled for 18 hours through 3 airports, and had arrived at the Grand Meridian with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of worry. He hadn't thought about how he looked. He hadn't considered that his appearance might matter. Because in his mind, he was coming home, and home was supposed to welcome you no matter what. James walked toward the front desk, and he noticed it immediately, the way eyes followed him. Not with curiosity, not with the welcoming gaze that staff were supposed to offer every guest. No, these looks were different. He could feel the weight of judgment in them, the silent questions, the assumptions being made with every step he took across that polished marble floor. A woman in a perfectly tailored blazer, her name tag read Victoria, guest relations manager, was standing behind the front desk, and James watched her expression shift as he approached. Her smile didn't falter. Not exactly, but it changed. It became tighter, more guarded. Her eyes flicked to his hoodie, to the duffel bag hanging from his shoulder, to the scuff marks on his sneakers, and something in her gaze hardened. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice was polite but distant. The kind of politeness that was really a wall, a way of saying, "I'm doing my job, but I don't actually want to." James smiled warmly. He was used to this. He had learned long ago that the world made assumptions about black men, especially black men who didn't dress the way society expected them to. He didn't take it personally anymore. He just worked to prove them wrong. "Yes, I'd like a room, please," James said. "Something on the upper floors if possible." "I've had a long trip." Victoria's smile tightened further. "Sir, this is the Grand Meridian. Our standard rooms begin at $1,500 per night. Perhaps I could recommend a more suitable property nearby." James felt the words land like small stones against his chest. He understood what she was really saying. She wasn't recommending another hotel because she thought he might prefer something different. She was recommending another hotel because she had looked at him and decided he didn't belong here. He didn't fit the picture in her mind of what a Grand Meridian guest should look like. James kept his voice calm, kept his smile in place. Even though something old and tired was stirring in his gut, the exhaustion of having to prove his worth over and over again. In a world that constantly demanded he justify his existence in spaces that should have welcomed him freely. "I appreciate the information," James said, "but I'm fine with the pricing. I'd like a room, please." Victoria's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. She glanced to her left, where a young man in a concierge uniform was watching the exchange with obvious interest. Then she looked back at James and said, "I'm afraid I'll need to see a credit card and identification before we can proceed." "Hotel policy." James nodded. "Of course." He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out his wallet, a simple leather wallet, worn soft from years of use. He handed Victoria his driver's license and a black credit card. She took them with 2 fingers as if she was afraid of touching something contaminated and looked at the license. Her eyes scanned the name, James Michael Jr. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Confusion, maybe, or the faintest hint of recognition, but it passed quickly, replaced by that same cold politeness. "I'll need to verify this card," she said. "It might take a few minutes," and she walked away, disappearing into a back office without another word. James waited. 5 minutes passed, then 7. Around him, the lobby hummed with quiet activity, guests coming and going, bellhops pushing luggage carts, the soft murmur of conversations in various languages. But James noticed that no one approached him. No one offered him water or asked if he'd like to sit in the lounge while he waited. Instead, he saw staff members glancing at him and then quickly looking away, whispering to each other behind their hands. And then, after nearly 10 minutes, a security guard approached. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with the kind of face that had been hardened by years of confrontation. His name tag read Dennis, and his hand was already moving toward James's chest before he even spoke. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." James frowned. "I'm sorry. I'm just waiting for the front desk to verify my card." Dennis shook his head slowly. "We've received reports that you've been making other guests uncomfortable. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property." James felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. "Making guests uncomfortable. I've been standing here quietly for the past 10 minutes. I haven't spoken to anyone except the woman at the front desk." But Dennis wasn't listening. His hand was on James's chest now, pressing firmly, pushing him back toward the revolving doors. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. You need to leave, or I'll be forced to call the police." The lobby had gone quiet. James could feel every eye in the room on him, guests pausing mid-conversation, staff members watching from behind desks and doorways, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. And in that moment, James understood something with perfect clarity. These people had looked at him and seen a threat. They had looked at his skin, his clothes, his worn bag, and they had decided that he was dangerous, that he was unwanted, that he didn't deserve to breathe the same air as the wealthy guests who floated through this space in their designer clothes and expensive perfume. They hadn't asked his name. They hadn't checked his reservation. They hadn't done anything except judge him based on the color of his skin and the simplicity of his outfit. Victoria appeared in the background, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk playing at the corners of her lips. She had called security. She had made the decision to humiliate him, and she thought she had won. James looked at the hand on his chest. He thought about his mother's phone call. He thought about his father lying in a hospital bed somewhere in this city, his body fighting a battle it might not win. He thought about all the years his father had spent building this empire, brick by brick, fighting racism and discrimination at every turn, proving again and again that a black man could succeed in an industry that had tried so hard to keep him out. And James made a decision. "Dennis," James said quietly, "I need you to remove your hand from my chest." Something in his voice had changed. It was still calm, still measured, but there was steel underneath it now, the same steel that had built the Michael Hotel Group from the ground up. Dennis hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. James reached slowly into his duffel bag and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number and put it on speaker. The call connected after 2 rings. "Grand Meridian corporate office, this is Helen speaking." "Helen, this is James Michael Jr. I need you to connect me to the regional director of operations. Now." The silence that followed was deafening. Dennis's hand fell away from James's chest like it had been burned. Victoria's smirk vanished, replaced by something that looked a lot like terror. Helen's voice came back, shakier than before. "Of course, Mr. Michael. One moment, please." While he waited, James looked at Dennis, then at Victoria, then at all the other staff members who were now frozen in place, their faces pale with dawning realization. "My father built this hotel," James said, his voice carrying across the silent lobby. "He built this entire company. He started with one small motel in Alabama when he was 23 years old, and everyone told him he would fail because black men didn't own hotels. They told him he was reaching too high. They told him to stay in his place, and he ignored every single one of them. He worked 18-hour days for 30 years. He sacrificed his health, his time with his family, his own happiness, all to build something that would last. And do you know what he always said? He said that Michael Hotels would be different. He said that in his hotels, every single guest would be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from, because he knew what it felt like to be judged. He knew what it felt like to walk into a room and have people decide you were worthless before you ever opened your mouth. The regional director's voice came through the phone, a man named Gerald Patterson who had been with the company for 15 years and who knew exactly who James Michael Jr. was. "Mr. Michael, what can I do for you?" James looked at Victoria, looked at Dennis. Looked at all of them. "Gerald, I need you to initiate termination procedures for the entire front desk staff, the guest relations manager, and the head of security at the Grand Meridian, effective immediately." Gerald didn't hesitate. "Consider it done, sir. May I ask what happened?" "You may," James said. "I walked into my father's hotel, tired, worried about his health, wanting nothing more than a room where I could shower and rest before going to see him. And I was profiled. I was judged. I was physically pushed toward the exit and threatened with arrest. Not because I did anything wrong, but because these people looked at me and decided I didn't belong here." Victoria stepped forward, her face ashen, her hands trembling. "Mr. Michael, please. I didn't know. I'm so sorry. I would never have." "You would never have what?" James interrupted, and his voice was cold now. Cold in a way it had never been before. "You would never have treated me that way if you had known who I was. That's exactly the problem. You shouldn't have treated me that way regardless of who I was. The man standing in front of you 10 minutes ago, the man in the hoodie with the dusty jeans, he deserved the same respect as any guest who walks through those doors. But you didn't see a guest. You saw a black man who didn't look rich enough, and you decided to humiliate him." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was heavy with disappointment. "My father fought his whole life against exactly this kind of treatment. He built this company to be better, and you have proven that even in his own hotel, even within the empire he created, the same prejudice still exists." By now, a crowd had gathered. Guests had stopped pretending not to watch and were openly staring. Some had their phones out, recording. Others were whispering to each other, their eyes wide with shock. A woman stepped forward, an elderly guest with silver hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple but elegant dress. She had been sitting in the lounge, watching everything unfold. "Young man," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I saw everything. I saw the way they looked at you when you walked in. I saw the way they whispered. I saw the security guard put his hands on you. And I want you to know that I am ashamed. I am ashamed that I sat there and did nothing. I am ashamed that I let this happen without speaking up." James looked at her, and something in his expression softened. "You're speaking up now," he said quietly. "That matters." The woman shook her head. "It's not enough. It's never enough when we only speak up after the damage is done. But I want you to know that there are people who see you, who see what happened, and who will never forget it." She turned to Victoria and Dennis, both of whom were standing in silence, their faces twisted with fear and regret. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," she said. "Not because you got caught, But because somewhere along the way you decided that certain people were worth less than others based on nothing more than appearance. And that is a moral failure that no termination will ever fix. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Gerald Patterson arrived personally, along with a team from corporate HR. Termination paperwork was processed. Security footage was reviewed, confirming every detail of James's account. New staff members were brought in from other Michael properties to cover the sudden vacancies. And through it all, James stood in that lobby, watching, waiting, feeling the weight of what had happened pressing down on his shoulders. He hadn't wanted this. He had never wanted to be the kind of person who fired people, who wielded his family's power like a weapon. But what choice did he have? If he had walked away, if he had let this slide, he would have been complicit in his own degradation. He would have taught these people that they could treat black guests, treat any guest, with disrespect and face no consequences. And that was something he couldn't do. Not to himself, not to his father's legacy, not to every black person who had ever walked into a space and been made to feel like they didn't belong. Finally, when the chaos had settled and the terminated staff had been escorted from the building, James took the elevator to the penthouse suite, the suite his father always kept reserved for family. He stood at the window, looking out at the city his father had conquered through sheer force of will, and he allowed himself to feel everything he had been holding back: the exhaustion, the anger, the profound sadness of knowing that no matter how much progress was made, no matter how many barriers were broken, there would always be people who looked at black skin and saw something lesser, something suspicious, something to be feared and rejected. The next morning, James went to the hospital. His father was in a private room, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with quiet efficiency. James Saar looked smaller than James remembered, thinner, more fragile, as if the fire that had always burned so bright inside him was finally beginning to dim. But when James walked through the door, his father's eyes lit up with a fierce, undiminished pride. "I heard what happened," James Saar said, his voice rough but strong. "Gerald called me last night, told me everything." James sat down beside the bed and took his father's hand, something he hadn't done since he was a child. "I didn't want to do it, Dad, but I didn't know what else to do." James S.R. nodded slowly. "You did the right thing. I know it doesn't feel like it right now. I know you're the kind of man who wants to believe in second chances, who wants to give people the opportunity to grow and change. I've always admired that about you, even when I didn't understand it. But there are times when mercy becomes complicity. There are moments when the only way to stand up for what's right is to draw a line and refuse to let anyone cross it." He squeezed James's hand with surprising strength. "What happened in that lobby wasn't just about you, son. It was about every black man and woman who has ever been judged before they had a chance to speak. It was about every person who has ever been made to feel unwelcome in a space that should have embraced them. By taking action, by refusing to let those people hide behind their prejudice, you sent a message. You said that this kind of behavior has consequences, that it will not be tolerated. Not in our hotels, not in our world." James left the hospital that evening with his father's words echoing in his mind. He walked through the city streets as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and he thought about everything that had happened. He thought about Victoria, who had probably woken up that morning believing she was a good person, only to discover that the biases living inside her had led her to do something ugly and cruel. He thought about Dennis, who had put his hands on a stranger without cause, simply because someone in a position of authority had told him that stranger was a threat. He thought about all the guests who had watched the scene unfold and said nothing, content to be bystanders to injustice as long as it didn't affect them personally. And he thought about himself, because the truth was, James had biases too. Everyone did. The difference wasn't in whether you had them, it was in what you did about them. It was in whether you examined your assumptions, challenged your prejudices, and worked every single day to treat people with the dignity they deserved. That was the work. That was the lifelong, never-ending work of being a good human being in a world that constantly tempted you to be otherwise. In the weeks that followed, the Grand Meridian underwent a transformation. New training programs were implemented, not just at that property, but across the entire Michael Hotel Group. Every employee, from housekeeping to executive management, was required to complete extensive courses on implicit bias, respectful guest treatment, and the history of discrimination in the hospitality industry. James personally oversaw the curriculum. He brought in experts, scholars, people who had spent their lives studying these issues. He didn't want surface level He wanted something deeper, a fundamental shift in the culture of the company his father had built. Because the truth was, what happened to James could happen to anyone. It could happen to a black businessman in a suit. It could happen to a Hispanic mother with her children. It could happen to a Muslim family on vacation. It could happen to anyone who didn't fit the narrow, prejudiced picture that some people carried in their minds of what a legitimate guest looked like. And James refused to let that continue. Not on his watch, not in his father's legacy. 1 year later, James stood in the lobby of the Grand Meridian once again. He was still wearing casual clothes, still preferred comfort to fashion, but this time, no one looked at him with suspicion. This time, when he walked through those revolving doors, he was greeted with genuine warmth, with smiles that reached people's eyes, with the simple respect that every human being deserved. Behind the front desk stood a new team, people who had been hired not just for their skills but for their character, people who understood that the measure of their work wasn't in how they treated the guests who looked rich and powerful, but in how they treated the ones who didn't. James had learned something that day a year ago. He had learned that power came with responsibility. That privilege was meaningless if you didn't use it to make the world a little bit better. And that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to accept treatment that diminished your humanity, not just for yourself, but for everyone who would come after you. His father passed away 3 months after that day in the hotel. He went peacefully, surrounded by family, knowing that his legacy was in good hands. And James carried that legacy forward, not with arrogance, not with vengeance, but with the quiet determination of a man who understood that the fight for dignity was never truly won. It had to be fought again and again, every single day, in every single interaction, and he was ready. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the way we judge people based on how they look, if it reminded you that everyone deserves dignity and respect regardless of their appearance or background, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us your own story, because we all have them. And remember, the next time you meet a stranger, look past the surface, look past the clothes and the car and the assumptions your mind wants to make. Because you never know who you're really talking to. You never know what battles they've fought, what mountains they've climbed, what empires they might be carrying on their shoulders. Treat everyone like they matter, because they do. We'll see you in the next story.